in the session title. So this idea of flipping the paradigm stems from an essay by Tom Mays, the Deputy General Counsel for the National Trust for Historic Preservation, called Changing the Paradigm from Demolition to Reuse, Building Reuse Ordinances. So in his essay, Mays suggests a unique solution to the issue of demolition culture, which is to establish an ordinance that promotes reuse of existing buildings and prohibits demolition based on the need for environmental sustainability rather than just historic significance. So Mays posits that by promoting the sustainable aspect of preservation and reuse, more buildings could be saved. And in theory, this ordinance would help achieve several community goals at once. So older buildings would be saved, preserving the culture and identity of a neighborhood, and reuse would limit the amount of material being transported to landfills and the environmental damage caused by extraction and transportation of new materials. This ordinance, however, would not come without certain compromises or challenges for preservationists. So we've decided to use this essay today as a starting point for our discussion because this Mays' solution touches on several important topics and issues that must be considered in order to promote preservation as a tool to create and maintain healthy, happy, and livable communities. Mays' solution puts an emphasis on the need to evaluate the goals and methods of historic preservation and to examine how they might be integrated with other community goals, as well as the importance of communicating and coordinating with other groups outside of the field of preservation and the ability to compromise when necessary. So in an effort to engage with those from different backgrounds and consider various perspectives, our panelists come from a variety of professions. Some are preservation related or adjacent. And with that, I'll introduce each of our panelists and give them an opportunity to make a statement about the essay or the topic. And then we'll move to the roundtable discussion portion of the session before taking any questions at the end. All right, so Dee Durham's lifelong passion for conservation and historic preservation is evident in her professional experience. Dee has served as Executive Director for Preservation Delaware and SAVE, a land use, conservation planning, and transportation advocacy organization based in Chester County, Pennsylvania. In 2010, Dee co-founded Plastic Free Delaware and continues to lead its initiatives. And since 2018, Dee has served as a Newcastle County Council member and has led the conservation, oh, I messed something up there. She's led efforts to promote ordinances that help to conserve and protect historic buildings.
Thanks so much, Alex. It's great to be here today and be part of this panel. I thought Mays' article was just so fascinating, and I'm so glad to be a part of this discussion and learn from it myself. I made a few notes, just kind of random thoughts that sprung to mind as I was contemplating the theme as you laid out. And it is, as you said, I co-founded Plastic Free Delaware, and as part of that, we've also spun off another organization now called Zero Waste First State. So that combined with everything else that I've been involved in for the last few decades, you know, it makes perfect sense to be part of this discussion. But one question I like to ask people when we're talking about things like this and historic resources and preservation is, and land use is, where do you like to vacation? Because I think, you know, when people vacation, they often go, say, to historic cities in Europe, or even to Williamsburg, or historic towns all around the country, or, you know, historic Lewis here in Delaware, or downtown Wilmington. When you go to dine out, you know, unless you're going out maybe for a quick strip mall dinner, I think a lot of people like to go to historic buildings that have character. So absolutely, the one question, you know, is it can be, or should preservation of historic resources be part of an economic development engine? The answer is absolutely yes. It is already, and I think part of the problem is that there just isn't a wide enough recognition of the role historic resources play there. And it, you know, we could probably spend all day talking about Don Ripkemo's work in proving through various studies all around the country, actually he works all around the world, and kind of proving the economic value of historic resources. So anyway, additionally, I would say that the reuse of historic buildings, and that the worst case scenario, parts of historic buildings, which is going on, I know for sure on the West Coast, and deconstruction codes are absolutely part of a green agenda and sustainability, so that we reduce, as Alex already said, reduce what ends up in the landfill. And it's probably, if everyone I'm sure is familiar with the reduce, reuse, recycle pyramid, well, reducing what goes to the landfill comes before recycling or building new, for instance. So absolutely, it's the reuse of historic buildings should be part of what any municipality or government agency is working on in its sustainability plan. So we do, we've been started working the last 2 years on a lot of different aspects of the Newcastle County Code, trying to carrots and sticks, incentives and regulations that will get more properties into historic overlay zoning, because well, for one reason, we have an ordinance coming along right now, which is number 20-071, which will allow the Historic Review Board to deny demolition of historic resources if they're in an H overlay zone. So that's one exciting aspect of 20-071, because without that, we don't have the power to actually deny demolition. And so a lot of what we have been up against is just trying to use carrots rather than sticks. And there's a role for both, and we need to do more of both, I think, to foster the reuse of historic buildings. So that's it in a nutshell for me, and look forward to the discussion.
Great, thank you, Dee. Thanks so much. So up next, Mary Lou Erler is a historic architect and the Chief of Cultural Resources at Independence National Historical Park in Philadelphia. Previously, she was the Chief of Cultural Resources at Gateway National Recreation Area, which is a unit of the National Park Service, where she oversaw the Cultural Resource Division, which includes over 600 historic structures in 9 historic districts, one being a National Landmark Historic District, 300 archaeological sites, and a museum collection. Prior to joining National Park Service in 2008, Ms. Erler was in private practice specializing in the preservation and restoration of historic structures. She serves as a member of the New Jersey State Historic Sites Council and is a former member of her township's Historic Commission, where she helped to write the Historic Preservation Ordinance. Welcome, Mary Lou.
Thank you, Alex. I've worked in preservation, as Alex said, for many years, from the grassroots level, helping to write our preservation ordinance, which I do admit dealt with demolition, but could not prevent it. And I've also done some consulting for other historic preservation commissions with great downtowns. But again, their ordinances did not prevent demolition. Kind of delays it, slows it, but does not prevent it. I found this article really thought-provoking in terms of thinking about other ways to think about preservation and encouraging the adaptive reuse. Certainly at Gateway National Recreation Area, we are leasing a number of our historic buildings, and we are looking at adaptive reuse all the time. I spent a lot of my time reviewing adaptive reuse projects. It is a National Historic Landmark District of which the buildings are in not very good condition and which the Park Service does not have a use. And this is the way that we can reuse those buildings. But we encourage that financially, because what we can offer is an offset of the rent. So someone come in and rehabilitate it, and the money that they put forward then offsets their rent for a number of years. So thinking about this article and thinking about ways to encourage adaptive reuse before demolition, I look at it as also a financial issue. How do we not only educate the people that want to purchase these properties in historic districts, educate them about historic preservation, and also find ways to financially help them along, whether it's a tax credit program at a state level, a local level, or certainly the national level. But I think then we also need to consider taking it a step forward, because not all buildings are equally significant. And that's something that we also did at Gateway. With the number of buildings we had in very poor condition, we began to prioritize. And there are other efforts, both in England and other places, where they grade the buildings. So should we be looking at preservation the same way, say, for Independence National Historic Park, which is right now outside my new window? the same way we look at preservation of a small row house privately owned in a district, do we apply the standards the same way? And is that something else we should be looking at and thinking about as we consider these changes? Thank you.
Great, thanks, Mary Lou. So up next, we have Diane Laird. She's the Executive Director for Downtown Dover Partnership, a designated Main Street program and development corporation for Delaware's capital city of Dover, where she leads efforts in commercial property development and occupancy and promotes the city's rich economic, historic, and cultural assets. Prior to her current role, Diane served as the state coordinator for Downtown Delaware, the state's Main Street Coordinating Program Office and Community Revitalization Resource Center. She initiated the state's vacancy reduction programs, Project Pop-Up and Unlock the Block, regularly speaks at National Main Street America conferences, and has co-authored several articles for Main Street News on downtown business development and the AmeriCorps Vista program. Welcome, Diane.
Thank you, Alex. Pleasure to be here with you today. Something that's not in my bio is that when I was a young girl, I used to love to play with doll houses, and it wasn't the dolls that I played with. I actually didn't have any dolls in them at all, but I had the structure, and I always found it fascinating to electrify the walls and put working lamps, you know, at a 1-inch scale, and decorate the rooms fully with carpet and furniture and whatnot. And I think what that says is that we all have innate gifts, tendencies, and traits that develop over time. And for me, the built environment is really where my love has been and my interest, and so I've given a lot of thought to the built environment over time, as all of us here have, and all the attendees as well. My first career was in interior design, and that was of commercial buildings, and many of them, probably most of them in the 80s and 90s that I worked on, was with new construction. So my mind was not in historic preservation, but in the mid 90s, I decided to move to Delaware, go back to school for preservation, and thought about the retrofit of historic buildings and using my interiors background to retrofit. And so my thesis was actually on post office relocation from downtown locations, and that was it was a good way to focus my thoughts on preservation and bridging that gap between new and valuing the old and historic. So with that, I had an opportunity to look at a number of excellent retrofits of old post offices into theaters or museums or restaurants and bars and clubs and things like that. And that is exactly what I loved, because it was keeping an old quality historic building in use. And so, you know, one of the things that Mays mentioned was the idea of historic resources being cultural assets. And to me, that says we're keeping them fresh for every generation. So a building that was used for a post office, that was a center of activity and getting together for conversations, socializing, and then making that into a restaurant 20, 50, 70 years later brings a new kind of social equity to the building, so that it becomes a new memory and it continues to live that way. So this idea of retrofit is one that I have valued greatly over time, because an old building holds its value in my mind through its use, its continued use, it's staying living in the present day, and it also stays better maintained. It forces maintenance on the building. In terms of keeping it purely preserved, you know, I'm guilty. I'm not a purist preservationist, and you know, I used to be ashamed to say that too loudly, but at this point, I feel that having a building in use can celebrate the history while helping it to evolve. We as people evolve. I loved my children at 5. I don't want to preserve them at 5. I want them to keep growing and developing and staying significant and real for today. So yeah, a couple other reflections on his article. I would say it's necessary to have an intentional conversation about demolition and what are the alternates. What are the alternatives to demolishing? What are the values? What are the economics? And so that is a key point I felt that was so valuable from that article. And another one was that people often look at preservation as a roadblock. And if we can look at it as a bridge as opposed to a roadblock, I think we find that we meet in the middle and we both gain great value in that. Sometimes people cannot picture or they don't have ideas about what the possibilities are for a space. If we can help them with conceptuals or help them visualize, I think that brings value again to the conversation. And the last reflection quickly on his article is, will there be flexibility in the process? And how quickly can we get to the end of the story? You know, sometimes people lose interest just because the process takes so long. And so, you know, getting to the compromise in a timely manner will enable that to be a valuable tool. So looking forward to today's conversation.
Thanks, Diane. So Karen Marshall is the County Historic Preservation Officer for state and federal projects within Chester County, Pennsylvania. Ms. Marshall encourages historic preservation projects to enhance interpretation and heritage planning throughout Chester County in keeping with the goals for historic resources in Landscapes 2, the county's comprehensive plan. The technical assistance she provides to municipalities and the public includes guidance related to education and outreach programs highlighting area history, historic resource protection, historic resource surveys and documentation, historical commission organizational development and membership recruitment, National Register nominations, Section 106 and local ordinance application guidance, and historic structures reports and impact studies. Welcome, Karen.
Hi, Alex. Thank you for having me. So I prepared some comments, but I'd sort of forgotten. Oh, first I have to qualify. It's Landscapes 3. If my boss hears Landscapes 2, I'm going to be in trouble tomorrow. So I guess that was on my old bio. That's our new comprehensive plan. And I guess I wrote some formal statement, but I will sort of try to back off from that. I guess I want to start that. So I approach historic preservation in my work, the development of ordinances, standards, the implementation of them. I just think they're part of effective community planning. I don't think they're troublesome. I don't think that they get in the way any more than any other zoning ordinance, which, let's face it, zoning ordinance get in the way of any of us who own property and want to do something, and the municipality doesn't want us to do it. So the thing I encourage volunteers and local commissions to do is don't get defensive about what you do. Share what you love about what you do and what you enjoy. And I know that's very hard when you have an angry homeowner, but I think that that to me that's key. And then one of the things you had asked was what guides our work. How do we define historic preservation? And I'm sure you all can recite this, but I always go back to the National Historic Preservation Act of 1966. And I think it's always good to remember it. It begins: the spirit and direction of the nation are founded upon and reflected in its historic heritage. The historical and cultural foundations of the nation should be preserved as a living part of our community life and development in order to give a sense of orientation to the American people. I think those are such great words and well thought out, because what it says is that historic buildings, old buildings, whatever, they're living reminders of our heritage and our development, and then they provide orientation to our lives. They give us context. And so to me, the key is not if we preserve our historic resources and our historic landscapes, but how do we decide what warrants their preservation? And then instead of trying to get the public to understand this. You know, I don't understand why lots of things are regulated. What I think is that we have to get them to understand and appreciate and enjoy the stories these structures tell. Every building's got something to convey. And so coming into this position, Chester County has a very unusual tradition in the state of Pennsylvania. And we have 73 municipalities. And of those, 60 have local grassroots historical commissions. And in Chester County, historic preservation is a way of life. And if there's a community problem, if there's going to be a demolition, if there's a critical problem, there's usually a group of residents who are interested and want to get involved and have something to say. You mentioned Landscapes 3. I think one of the really exciting things I learned, and it's re-supported, even though we've had huge growth in the last 10 years, which has been a real problem in terms of continuing to educate the public. But there's a refrain in the county, I know Dee often heard it, open spaces and historic places. We've long linked our historic resources to our environmentally friendly practices. And when Landscapes 3, we had surveys for Landscapes 3 of, I think we had 6,500 responses. 90% of those responses supported both open space, the preservation of open space and historic resources. So, you know, we have this culture within the county that I think it's the local commissions, the adhering to, you know, grassroots, and letting communities decide for themselves. I say there's different models. We have sort of the tradifferent model of preservation where they preserve individual buildings. They're very growth oriented. You know, that's not my business to tell them what to do. My business is to help them preserve their resources, as opposed to their neighbor. Directly next to them is Charlestown Township, and they have huge expanses of open space, historic landscapes. It's just the community standard. So anyway, I don't want to go on and on. I probably talk too long. But in terms of the author, what I really thought was interesting is I think he was looking for a preservation standard that's probably more flexible, easier to apply, and he's a general counsel, probably easier to defend. But I thought rather than keep the ordinance separate, I really like this idea. I thought it was a great idea. I think that you should include your historic preservation standards as part of the ordinance. So you can identify structures for reuse at various levels to preserve or not to preserve integrity. I think that what it would mean, though, is that all building projects would incorporate preservation and reuse in their development formula. And that's what I loved about this idea. So that you're serving the community, you're encouraging thoughtful planning, community input, historic preservation when applicable, and of course, environmentally friendly practices. So that's, I think we'll have a great discussion.
Thank you, Karen. Appreciate it. So up next is Sean O'Neill. Sean is a policy scientist at the University of Delaware's Institute for Public Administration, where he works on applied research projects with state agencies like DelDOT and the Office of State Planning Coordination, comprehensive plans and related projects with local communities from the city of Wilmington down to Sussex County, and he manages IPA's Local Government Leaders Training Program. Prior to joining IPA, Sean was a senior planner with the Chester County, Pennsylvania Planning Commission, where he coordinated housing and emergency management related efforts and worked directly with municipalities through the county's Vision Partnership Program. Sean serves on the executive committee of the Delaware chapter of the American Planning Association and as a co-chair of the ULI Delaware Council. Welcome, Sean.
Thank you. Thank you. It's a great introduction. And as Alex said, I work at University of Delaware Institute for Public Administration, which is a sister center in the Biden School of Public Policy to CHAD. So very happy to be here today. And as she described, I work a lot with all 57 municipalities and 3 counties throughout the state, and have a background as a planner. I should also say, in addition to working at Chester County Planning Commission previously with Karen Marshall, who I actually shared a cubicle wall with while I was there, and learned a great deal from Karen. I also worked at City of Annapolis. I noticed in the chat that Lisa Craig is here with us today. So happy to see her here. We our paths crossed only for a brief period of time while I was at City of Annapolis, but I was glad to see her on the call here today too. So I found the essay very interesting, and I think the ordinance outline, could be a very useful tool in communities. I guess my thought on this, and I should also say I have some background in real estate, particularly market research. So that's kind of where my background comes from as a planner and someone that's worked in real estate. So I think a key aspect to keep in mind on this topic always, in my point of view, is the need to better promote and educate everybody about what historic preservation is and the variety of benefits it can offer, and also the variety of ways that it can be implemented. I think Karen kind of alluded to this. I think it's also very important to try and keep the economics of various buildings and various communities in mind also, in an effort to maintain the value of the historic assets. Right now, I guess on top of my mind, local governments are faced with huge problem with budget deficits, housing, unemployment, public health crisis as a result of the pandemic. And I fear that some of the protections that are in place could be at risk over the next year or two as communities try to figure out, how to create more value and investment in their communities by, removing these perceived barriers. So I think any additional tools that can be implemented, variety of options is good to have, and education is more important than ever. I think there's also a balance and a risk to losing value of historic buildings and assets if the needed investment is not feasible due to regulations and other reasons. And at times it can be seen by many communities as a barrier to investment in those communities. So it's obviously not an easy topic to address, but, as somebody that has experience, living in places like City of Annapolis and working in Annapolis and Chester County, I really value historic preservation. I value historic assets. And I want to see places preserved, in an appropriate way. But I think taking a nuanced view sometimes, to the extent possible, can be helpful in preventing demolitions, and potentially helpful in terms of even better educating the public by explaining to people that, if you identify properties or an area as historic assets, it doesn't necessarily mean that, you're implementing all these protections and regulations that people, need to apply to their properties. There are various levels and different ways to approach this that, as Karen said, is just a part of community planning. It's a way to identify valuable properties and assets that communities want to preserve, as much as possible. So I'm happy to be here today, and I'm looking forward to the discussion. Thanks.
Thank you, Sean. All right, last but not least, we have Ryan Spack. Ryan is the principal and founder of the Spack Group, a Philadelphia-based equitable real estate development company, and he has 15 years of entrepreneurial experience in building maintenance, construction, and real estate development. Ryan's passion for Philadelphia's neighborhoods, their history, and its real estate led him to develop Project Rehab, a program to help property owners in University City remediate distressed properties. Since 2011, Project Rehab has positively affected development in over 55 buildings, creating approximately $26.3 million in additional real estate value. Ryan is a member of several boards and local committees, and he has won the University City Historical Society's Outstanding Preservation Award 3 times. So welcome, Ryan.
Thank you very, very much. It's an honor to be a part of this conversation, especially because I'm coming from a different place as both a developer and someone who sees the benefits and the downsides. I thought one of the ways to introduce my concepts behind this article was to introduce my company a little bit. So if you don't mind, I'm going to share my screen. and show you a little bit about what we do. Can you see that? Let's see. Can you see that? Awesome. And so we are a social impact real estate development company. The Spack group has this idea that development should involve the community, and because historic preservation is something that always involves the community, as the writer said, people crave continuity in their communities, and so we have found that to be very true. And so one of the things that we want to do in every one of our developments is involve that community, even if a variance isn't required. And because of that community involvement, I was asked by the University City District to engage the community in a creative way to alleviate distressed properties within the boundaries of the district. License and inspections within the city of Philadelphia has a certain stick that it can use, but most of the time there's very little support to those owners. And most of the time those owners really don't understand the ins and outs of rehabilitation, redevelopment, the processes thereof. And so my experience allows them to speed that process up. And so you can see some of the work. Instead of knocking a building down that has been fire damaged, instead it gets rebuilt as a single family home. Instead of turning around and knocking down a 2-bedroom, very tiny house that is a block away from the center of our eds and meds district, turn around and turn it into an adaptable rehab duplex where the owner lives on the 2nd and 3rd floors, and a family member who has some handicap issues has accessibility to the 1st floor. Instead of knocking down fire damaged apartments, creating a gigantic hole on a rather intact block, help the owner salvage those properties. Instead of the city of Philadelphia knocking down a vacant church that was built in 2 sections in 1899 and then 1901, and turn it into an adaptive reuse project. This is 22 or 21 apartments, a co-working space, 2 daycares, and a publishing company. And so in 10 years that I've been doing the project Rehab as a practice, we have implemented through Spack Group kind of those same concepts of how can we use preservation to build value in our properties, to build uniqueness in those properties, to keep continuity together for the community as a conversation. And that all kind of ties into create walkable corridors, working with those that are most disenfranchised, and at the end of the day, create art and light and preservation while trying to build equitable housing. And so these are some of the projects that we have as a company have undertaken over the last several years. This was a property that was had a deed restriction on it from the Redevelopment Authority, and became regrettably a drug house, and then became this vacant disaster right in the heart of University City. This is what it looks like today. This is one of the properties that we've won awards for. This is called Larchwood Flats. This was a 6-unit tenement building with a commercial space on the 1st floor that had had a fire, had had water damage, had a collapsing rear structure to it. This is what it looks like today inside. This building is one of those that where our experience was we wanted to keep the building standing, even though it had collapsed within itself. And we wanted to do that because the rest of the block was intact. But this is one of those experiences as a developer where the numbers did not work. Of all the projects that we have undertaken as a developer, this one to this day is still hundreds of thousands of dollars in debt to its partnership. This is one of those scenarios where saving this property might not have financially made much sense. I say all of that to say we have amazing pictures of its salvation, of its reconstruction, of what it looks like today, of what it looks like on the outside, and what it's been turned into, which has been fantastic for us as a company and as a community, but financially I can see the downsides to preservation. Simultaneously, we have not only just salvaged facades of buildings and their use, but also murals have taken on that kind of preservation for us as well. You'll see the mural on the top left was called Broken Chains, and it was a mural that the property owners had put in place in the 90s with their own money. When we bought the property, the community came to us and told us how impactful that mural was, but it was falling apart. It was starting to get cracked. And so we worked with Mural Arts program in Philadelphia to engage the community in taking that same theme and creating something called Breaking Chains. And that mural has now been expanded to 2 stories in the entire facade of the side of that project. And then you can see this is the building that had collapsed on itself. We've just recently opened a restaurant there, and we've added a mental health awareness mural. And so we've taken this facade and have made it even more. And so there's been an amazing opportunity for us to get involved from that perspective of preservation, but we can also see the downsides as some of our projects have ended up costing us significant amounts of money, where had we just done demolition, it would have been much faster, much cheaper. And so I see the upsides. I also see the downsides. The overall attitude I had towards this article was similar to the concerns I have about the city of Philadelphia right now, is that it will regulate and tax itself into oblivion. And real estate is all about the finances at the end of the day. And the cost of construction is what it is. The hard costs remain relatively constant. The soft costs, pretty much the same unless you start adding additional regulations like utility plans and things like that. But overall, those 2 numbers relatively stay the same. The numbers that move, financing costs, your cost to buy the land, and your cost to actually make money as a developer for undertaking this development. If you overregulate it, the numbers go up on the hard and soft costs. Well, that means less money to actually, for the developer to take on the risk. Throw in financing, if those numbers were to increase, if the interest rates were to hit 5%, and certain projects no longer work. If they hit 7%, a lot of projects no longer work. And so there's this fine balance that I think gets missed in this essay. But I agree with the other panelists. It was a very thought-provoking concept, and I'm glad to be here to talk about it.
Thank you, Ryan. That's great. Those were some really great photos. I think that just goes to show, what can be done if everything if people work together and everything makes sense, I think, as you said. So, all right, so let's get started. So I think one of the biggest things, I guess, or pretty much as soon as you start reading the essay, he opens with kind of 2 seemingly disparate goals, right? Historic preservation and the desire to develop progressive and sustainable cities. And so, he kind of talks about how communities are competing to be green. They're doing all of these different things in order to achieve that goal. But they aren't typically promoting the reuse of existing buildings as a means to reach that goal. So, you have that wasteful and unsustainable cycle of construction, demolition, and reconstruction, right? But at the same time, these same communities are craving that sense of continuity and memory and identity that we know are embodied in our historic buildings. So I think, my big question is, so these 2 desires are often at odds, or at least are perceived to be. So what are your thoughts on this? Does preservation stand in the way of progress?
I guess I'll take the first crack at that. No, preservation does not stand in the way of progress. It can be a hindrance. It can be a pain in the ass, especially if it's overregulated. But we did a project. It was a warehouse, and this goes back to, I think, something that Karen had mentioned about zoning use. We purchased a warehouse in an area that doesn't have a lot of development happening in it. The warehouse sat on a lot that was 3,400 square feet. The warehouse's footprint was 3,370 square feet. So the warehouse took up the entirety of the parcel. Ironically, the warehouse was zoned single family. Now the warehouse was 104 years old. It was built as a funeral home on the first floor, an embalmment center in the basement, and a casket making company on the second and third floors. I have never seen a building built the way this building was built. You could park a tank inside this building. It was structurally incredibly so sound, but it was laid out horribly. Its zoning use was a disaster. There was no incentives really for a developer to save this building other than the fact that the building was built so damn well. What ended up happening was us having a 7-month zoning fight to make the finances work for the building. Now today, the building is 14 residential units, 12 of which are all leased to voucher tenants with the Philadelphia Housing Authority, all with private money, no public funds whatsoever touched that building. But one of the things that were very interesting and something that we did with that building that we hadn't done with any of the others was we used a deconstruction nonprofit that partnered with 2 local other nonprofits that were doing work related to job training. And so this nonprofit oversaw these job training nonprofits who ended up bringing folks in to learn the trade of deconstruction. Now, it slowed down our progress, which was not great because we have interest payments to make to our bank. But at the end of the day, all the material that came out went to this nonprofit and was resold at their restore. And as a result, we got a tax deduction that reduced our capital into the initial purchase of the property by $107,000. And so financially, not only did it make sense from an environmental standpoint, and from a moral standpoint of having people trained, but financially it made sense. And so I think from that perspective, it makes preservation very much worth everyone's time and energy.
I'd like to ask Ryan a question, if you don't mind, Alex. Because Ryan, you've talked about obviously how important the finances are to such projects, but I'm interested to know if you've used, for that project or other projects, if you use the federal preservation tax credit for commercial projects. And in the case that you just mentioned, there's also a preservation tax credit for housing units. So for low-income housing, affordable housing. So I'm surprised, we were chatting about this earlier in the chat about that you haven't used those tax credits, and I'm just interested to know why. I'm
going to be totally frank. I don't like, this is going to sound horrible. I don't like the government regulating my business. We don't go after LIHTC money for our affordable housing projects because I don't want to deal with the Davis-Bacon Act. I don't want to waste 10 months of my life filling out paperwork and paying consultants to hammer me with the Pennsylvania state budget. That if the Republican House can't get with the Democratic governor, the budget gets delayed and we don't receive $1.2 million in funding for a housing project. If I don't build that project, the people that need that housing don't get those houses.
These are tax
we
credits.
found a way to do all of this without any regulation.
These are
from that perspective. Obviously, we still have to build to the code and we still have to deal with L&I and we have variances and all of those things. But the nuances of going after that have become cumbersome. And so we've avoided them wherever and whenever possible. On some of these projects, like the one that has the mental health awareness, they're too small.
So I think what Ryan just said sort of fits with what I was sort of looking at in terms of some kind of an innovative and new way of looking at regulation. And that is that, and I know this is probably idealistic, but try to deal with each development on its own merit and try to figure out some way to do that. There's some, there's some companies that do great with low-income housing and tax credits, and other businesses have different models. I think you have to be really careful not to go with a one size fits all, but I think communities have to be willing to work with our developers. But so this is something I wanted to ask, because I have Sean and Ryan both here. My understanding is that when I talk to developers, one of the problems is that banks offer less expensive money for new construction versus standing buildings and adaptive reuse. And so that's what I've always wondered, is if we need a change in a banking paradigm, because if you look at kind of, and I looked at this ordinance, I thought, this is just what they do in Europe. The old saying that as a country runs out of landfill, they start to reuse their buildings. I mean, that's sort of, like how it works. If you haven't got any place to lug the stuff, the bricks, the mortar, the timbers, then you just require reuse. And that's one of the things they do, in Europe pretty regularly, whether it's cost effective or not, because they have no place to put the stuff. So I would imagine, I've never looked into this, that there has to be some kind of banking that supports that. And so I've talked to several developers and asked them why they always develop the historic farmhouse in our complexes. Usually we manage to preserve the buildings whenever there's a development in Chester County. And why does the historic house get done last? And they say, because the money's more expensive. Yeah. And it's like, are you kidding me? Like, so why is that? So I think there's some basic financial fundamental issues that and again, that's why I like this idea of, okay, if we have to always reuse buildings, or, you have to argue not to, then maybe we'll look at the fundamental problems that face, the reuse of, our developers on a case-by-case basis. It wouldn't be case-by-case. It would be we'd look at it in a larger perspective in terms of review and community standards. I hope I'm making sense, but
No, you are, Karen, you're correct. You're correct. I mean, it's the analogy I would give is the same as to why doesn't the zoning code in Philadelphia or the building plans review department make it easier or speed up the process to build affordable housing, right? I mean, the system literally makes it more difficult. And the banking world does not necessarily look at preservation and all of the peripherals that we all collectively see as beneficial. They see the numbers, and to rehabilitate that old farmhouse costs more money, but that farmhouse still has the same value dollar-wise as a house that costs 40% of that farmhouse. What we see is the intrinsic values that will never get cataloged by a bank, a typical bank. And yeah, from that perspective, there would have to be a dynamic shift that takes into account those intrinsic values that don't necessarily translate into dollars. And
I think that, you always go back to for me, you go sort of back to Jane Jacobs and sort of the whole, what makes a place safe, what makes a community whole, what makes it, and it's familiar places. I love when you redid that church. I'm always thinking about those huge churches. That's fascinating. It makes your community stronger, healthier, safer. But you can't necessarily quantify those things, but
correct.
Know that it's proven intrinsically, but anyway, it's hard to quantify. But I think that there's, but again, I feel like the places, I always love the landfill concept. Like, can't we get there somewhere without just running out of place to put our excess stuff? How do we do this? How do we, anyway.
That's a great point, Karen. And I think, this actually we've already kind of moved into, I think, maybe one of the other questions I had, which, are are there limitations to rehab and reuse? We've obviously discussed, I think the economic side or the funding is it a major one? I guess, are there any other limitations that you can think of, or at least things that are perceived limitations or drawbacks? I think that maybe is an important part here too, is of course everybody has different experiences, and I think perception in the field of preservation can be a challenge sometimes. So does anybody have Any other thoughts on that?
I just wanted to add one point to the previous comment that I think, like, from a banker's perspective, Ryan, you can probably speak to this better than me, but developers and bankers want to avoid risk usually as much as possible.
I don't know about all that. Risk is not one of the things that we look at. We're project, go. But yes, underwriters from a bank are always risk adverse. Right.
So, I mean, and I think Ryan is, somewhat unique. I think that's true of a lot of developers.
It is.
A lot of developers, they have, their contractors and their companies that they work with, and they like to build a certain model for whatever they build, whether it's industrial or commercial or homes. And I think my sense anyway, from speaking to and working with developers over time, is that that's only gotten worse. Like the internal rate, the rate of return that lenders want now is higher than it was before the last recession. So it's not getting any easier, I guess, from that perspective, is my sense.
No, and COVID has made it even worse. We have watched over the last, we have a loan that's been in underwriting now for 5 weeks, and the holdup ended up becoming, or the only way that we were able to get our approval was a cash deposit that will sit in the bank for the 2.5 years of construction and lease up. Now, we don't even need that money to build. It's just cash deposited into their bank as kind of a safeguard guarantee. Prior to COVID, that was not a conversation we were having, not even close. And so it's becoming even more difficult. So add the cost of preservation into that, and it becomes very, very difficult.
Alex, if I may, I think one of the things we might want to do is discuss what preservation is. I mean, are we talking about full restoring of a building? Or are we talking about preserving the qualities that make it historic generally, and then bringing it up to current use? A lot of our historic buildings are in some ways energy efficient or have qualities about them that are sustainable and that are efficient, and also have many that are not. And so replacing a heating system or making windows more sustainable, or at least keeping the building and people inside more comfortable, that's a requirement. We want to live in a comfortable indoor environment. So defining what we mean by preservation, I think, is an important part of the conversation. And so that does bring up, I don't necessarily see these at odds, preserving and retrofitting. And I think there can be a transition to more and more sustainability and energy efficiency as a building is brought up to modern day standards. And I think we'd be remiss in the conversation if we didn't talk about where there are downtown development district funds available in the state. They are very confined areas of need within downtowns, maybe 12 downtowns in the state. But I think I'd be hard pressed to find another state that has so many incentives piled on top of one another that include historic tax credits, state and federal, as well as a variety of other incentives, funding, local incentives and permitting adjustments and that kind of thing. So I encourage anyone that's doing retrofit or considering an investment in a downtown that is a development district to look at that seriously, because it could be potentially 20, 30, 40% of the overall cost as a reimbursement. And that's a significant fill in a gap that's often in place with a historic structure. That's
a great point, Karen, or several points that you made, I think, and are definitely things that are important to address. I think, so we sort of kind of talked a little bit about the limitations, but I think, kind of segueing off of what you had just talked about, there are some benefits too, or some, incentives, as we've talked about. And so I think knowing that those do exist, and, I'm sure there are, ins and outs and drawbacks and things like that. But what do you think, do you think there's an issue with sort of information? Do people is it the problem that they don't know that these things are available, or they're not sure that how they work, or it's just perceived to be cumbersome? Do you have like a feeling for that?
To use the DDD, you mean? To use those particular, I think actually Delaware State Housing and our local communities and Delaware State Planning have done a terrific job in getting information out. But certainly for unincorporated areas, or even in the city of Dover, for instance, if it's not within the district, people may not be aware of it. But generally, I think they're pretty easy to use. You do have to put the money out first before getting reimbursed. So for some, that may be a challenge. But I think that generally it's pretty easy to access and use. There are limitations on the funds. You've got to get set-asides for some. But it's potentially 20% of construction costs, and it's not limited to commercial. It can be residential as well, as long as it's within the district.
So Alex, for the historic preservation tax credits from the federal level, I do think that many people see them as a challenge and a difficult to work their way through. More paperwork to do, and another layer of review. And I think people see it that way. Even some of the work we've been doing with lessees at our national parks, we give them all the information on tax credits at the federal level, and a lot of them choose not to go that route, even though they're required to meet the standards as a part of the Secretary of Interior standards as a part of their lease. They choose and elect not to go for the federal tax credits. So I think education is part of it. I think people understanding how the process actually works, I think would really go a long way to help people understand that these are here to encourage preservation and to help you offset some of the additional costs.
I'll just say, because at IPA, we've been pretty active and involved in the downtown development district work. We've had a contract with State Housing Authority the last 2 years to update the GIS, online GIS resource that tracks all the projects. And I've done some related research, not even directly with them on the program. And we actually had a webinar specifically intended to directed towards elected leaders this past, I guess, in September, that I helped put together with state housing and state planning. And what I'd say, in my view, there are two primary things with that program. One is that I think there is a lot of turnover in terms of planning commissions and elected leaders. And so I know state planning has run into this issue where newly elected officials aren't necessarily always caught up on these programs. They might not even know they're in a downtown development district. And if they do, they probably don't know what any of it means. So that was the idea with this webinar we put on. The second part is that, and I don't know the answer to this, Diane, you would know much better than me, but I don't know like how effective the incentives that are in place are. You know, like obviously there's a lot of money out there, but what does that mean for potential developers in these like small towns? You know, what is sort of the point that's going to make a difference for them if they want to invest in something? You know, those are the types of things I think that maybe could be looked at by the state at some point, just to evaluate, you know, how effective they are. So
I think that's a really good point in terms of incentives. I was at a really interesting hearing, and the supervisor who was trying to weaken the preservation ordinance in this particular township suddenly sort of called over our heads and said, look, there's Joe, whatever, in the back. He's a developer. Let's have him tell us how difficult, how obstructive preservation ordinances can be, or what his experience is. And the guy stands up and says, look, if it's laid out for me what your rules are, and if you're clear, and if you'll work with me, and if you'll provide incentives, there's no reason not to have historic preservation. I'm perfectly happy to preserve a building, or I'm perfectly happy to tear it down. You know, and I think what was really wonderful for those of us sitting there trying to help the historical commission is everybody in the room thought they knew what he was going to say. But he was quite clear that he needed to know what the ground rules were. He didn't want to have them changed halfway through the project. And he wanted to know right up front what incentives he could negotiate in terms, you know, of if in fact the cost was going to be higher to reuse the building as opposed to rebuild, you know, on that site. And then the second thing I wanted to say, and again, I understand the profit motive. Most of my background was with my husband works in private, you know, as an entrepreneur. But I think that again, that you know, I go back to I think zoning is a good thing, and the balance always is the reason we have zoning is that the federal government, the Constitution grants us use of our property, but they don't grant us best use. And I think the whole discussion in the development process and in terms of community planning is coming to terms with that compromise between best use and reasonable use, because as Ryan has said, as private business people, they have to make a living. That's why I guess I'm going back to your paradigm change. If we start with buildings have to be reused, I think the system will work itself out. Everybody who wants to make money will figure out how to make money. Anyway, I was just intrigued that a general counsel, you know, sort of came up with this idea of let's just change the whole paradigm.
And Karen, I think you bring up a good point as well. You know, sometimes it's the culture of no. Somebody wants to do something with their property and they hit the culture of no, you can't do that, you can't do this, you can't do that. And what you're saying is the guy's most willing to consider his options. So there again, it's partly education, it's partly simply an attitude with which they're received when they go in to ask the questions. And Sean, to your question about, you know, these layered incentives, I have to say that, you know, I could give you an example of a project that's in the works now where these incentives, the district incentives and the funding and the mechanisms, local, even down to a Main Street program level like ours is, where we offer facade improvements, these layered on once, and we have very good communications here in terms of the city, the state, and our office, very, very local, so that, and even county incentives. So when we're all talking and all these incentives are spiraling together, it really is significant. We have a building that's been vacant and disintegrating in some cases for well over 12 years. And just now we have a purchase on the table. I think it's going to happen. And, you know, between the carrots and the sticks, the fees that are now starting to be mounting up because of a vacant building, and then the fact of us coming in and saying, here are your variety of incentives, all of a sudden the price of the building came down, you know, $60,000, $80,000, and that is where the difference is made. It's when all these things start working together. It takes time, takes great communication, and it takes somebody willing to buy the building and do the right thing with it.
Absolutely. I think I wanted to ask Dee, like to hear from you a little bit. I think it would be interesting to hear about your work on county council with the Newcastle County ordinances and sort of the changes that you're proposing to make to those and sort of how that might fit into this discussion. Obviously, the essay is all about a new ordinance. So if you could, I'd like to hear a little bit about that. I think that'd be great.
Sure. Well, a couple things we have done in the last year is, as Diane just alluded to, is we've actually taken away the fee for a historic building if it's vacant. So you don't have to pay that fee anymore as long as you're in the process of getting a permit to restore it or whatever. So that's not a huge incentive, but a small one that hopefully will just be part of the toolbox. We also have reinstated a Newcastle County preservation tax credit with property tax credit that would hopefully go hand in hand, be dovetailed with the state forms. So if you're already going after the state tax credit, it would be just another very easy to add that on if your project is in Newcastle County. So we want to make sure that it's streamlined and easy and not, a cumbersome process. I don't know that we have any control over trying to make the federal credits easier to complete the paperwork for. But you know, we have been working with Tim Slavin's office, the SHPO's office, to try to at least make the county one dovetail with the state. So we're working on those types of carrots. And I did mention in terms of sticks, I guess, you know, we are instituting, hopefully, this ordinance that will soon be passed. It will allow us the option to deny demolition requests for H-zone properties. I guess the problem with that is we don't, right now, becoming an H-zoned property is strictly voluntary. And first of all, I don't think even a lot of the land use attorneys, let alone property owners, even a lot of the land use attorneys know about it, but I don't think they know about the benefits of being H-zoned. So I think we need to do a better job of getting the word out there about the tax credits, and maybe doing workshops like this to help developers understand or help them through the process. Maybe have some sort of preservation ombudsman that would help them with their paperwork or something beyond what the SHPO already does. But you know, I'm definitely open to ideas that you know, were discussed in the Mays article. I don't personally know of any, I don't know if you do, Alex, have any examples from around the country, things we could bring here in terms of, you know, regulating reuse rather than having things go to the landfill more, you know, more than we already are. Some innovative ideas. I know out on the West Coast, they are some municipalities and counties, I'm not sure, have started to regulate deconstruction and reuse of certain materials such as old growth lumber. We don't really have a lot of that here, I think, but you know, I'm definitely open to other examples that we might bring here, both carrots and sticks.
Oh, that's great. Thanks, Dee. I think one thing that does come to mind, and I know we're, let's see, it's 2:11, so we have about 20 minutes left. I know Michael said we do have some questions coming in, so I want to make sure that we leave time for those. But maybe just as a wrap up, I wanted to get at the question as best we can. I know we could talk about it forever, but Diane sort of alluded to it. But so Mays sort of ends his essay with, you know, a question, and he says, this ordinance, you know, that I'm suggesting that would require reuse, prohibit demolition, but would be flexible, right? It wouldn't, you know, other changes or modifications to the building would be allowed. You wouldn't have to adhere to the Secretary of the Interior standards or other sort of federal guidelines that we typically look to. But he says, is this preservation? So I think that's kind of, you know, that's the big question here is what is preservation? What does it mean to each of us? What does it mean to the public? You know, why do old places matter, to take, you know, to steal another Tom Mays idea? And, you know, how are preservation goals other community goals as well? So, you know, obviously the example here is sustainability. You know, we know inherently it is sustainable. So I guess, you know, what are your thoughts on that? What is preservation? You know, and I think the big idea is that there has to be compromise and there has to be flexibility at a certain point. But what does preservation mean to you?
So if I could just jump in, I found that inconsistent with the rest of the article, because I had to go back and reread the article when he said that, because he made a point of saying that his idea was not going to, it was going to work parallel with any existing ordinances dealing with historic resources. So when he asked the question, I thought, I don't know, I didn't quite understand, maybe everyone else can explain it to me, the point that he was trying to make. And that's why I guess when in my comments I said, I think that you could easily, you know, if you, you know, you just reverse zoning. So if you have to consider reuse before demolition, not demolition before reuse. That's all I thought he was saying. And then you have a scale. You'd have to identify, you know, you'd have to come up with various standards by which to decide, you know, how do you determine when it's reused, you know, and then what is the scale of the reuse, and just sort of what Diane said, you know, how much of the integrity of the building is maintained. It's pretty simple language, I think, in terms of preservation. And you would just make a determination. So some buildings would, you know, retain 90% integrity, and some would retain, you know, 20% integrity, or some never had any integrity to begin with, and you're just reusing them. So anyway, that was so I was confused about that.
So I kind of have to agree, because at one point in the article, it also talks about, although I want to be clear that I view a building reuse ordinance as an additional tool that could be used in conjunction with existing preservation. So I didn't see it. I know the article was about, is it preservation? Is it not? Is this a good tool? Should we be looking at that as well? But I didn't see it as a replacement. I see it as things that can work together. And I think looking at Ryan's work, I think it's very clear that he takes different approaches for different conditions that he finds as he goes forward. Whether it's putting an addition on a 2-story structure to make it habitable and actually make it function, or in the other case he showed, I'd call it almost a version of facadism, where he's holding up the facade and building something within. I mean, we all know cases in buildings where it's really beyond repair, and that's what you're going to do. But you still retain the fabric of the community and the fabric of the district. And I think that's what people look at when they move into these communities. It's the overall fabric, it's the feel. It may not be that individual building, but you're also looking at it as the community. And I think that's what people look to retain. So I see them as working together.
I think sometimes we may think too much about the list of things and less about simply asking a layperson to look at a building and say, what do you think? Is it something in the attic that we should keep, or is it just, you know, just sort of average? And I think, I mean, Disney creates old historic Main Street with a bunch of facades. So, and people really respond to that, right? They go there and they love that feel of bringing them back to the nostalgic Main Street. So, you know, in some cases, maybe the facade is enough. In other cases, it's not. Inside the building, fireplaces or other cornice work, you know, that becomes what makes it historic. So we may think too much about the list of standards, and we may just do a little bit more on gut. What buildings should be prioritized and what parts of the building make it historic. I mean, and that could be made a list a lot of times, but a lot of times it's probably pretty obvious.
Yeah, I would just say, you know, real quick, to me, I think historic buildings and aspects of historic properties that you want to preserve, the value of them is that it makes them unique, and it also ties us to the past, and it's part of what makes an area or, you know, a location unique, and it sort of flies in direct conflict with what I was saying before about, you know, financial sector wants. It's the value is exactly that. It is not replicable. It's totally unique, and that's what you want to preserve. So you know, there's no good solution there. And I sort of agree with what others had said about the article. I think it's a good idea, the ordinance that's presented, but I think it's just an additional tool that can be used, that's in the toolbox. And as Karen said, it's part of good community planning, and, you know, it's an option that local governments can choose to adopt.
I'd just like to add that I think I agree with everything that everyone has just said, and it seems to me that as a preservationist, some of the frustration lies in, I think, what at least I perceive, and others probably agree, is sort of an imbalance in the system, and how you know, things are, at least in Delaware or in Newcastle County, things have been for many decades sort of imbalanced in favor of demolition. And so how do we rebalance the whole system to preserve the important things, as some of you have just said, and preserve the features and the character of communities, historic communities or buildings, but also have the code be flexible enough so that maybe if something doesn't meet a certain standard, it can still be reused so that it doesn't end up in the landfill, and at least, you know, kind of shift the balance of power back towards a reuse mindset rather than a demolition mindset.
Exactly. Yeah, that's great. All right. Well, I think we probably, if everybody is okay, nobody has any last words, we'll maybe turn it over to Michael, and so he can ask some of the questions that we've received so far for you all to answer.
Alex, I just had one last thing I just wanted to interject, that living in Pennsylvania, you know, versus Delaware, there's something that I really pay attention to, and has nothing, in some ways has nothing to do with this, but it's car scale versus people scale. And, you know, Pennsylvania is really famous for its lousy roads, and Delaware is really famous for its good roads. But you know what? It makes historic preservation much easier in Pennsylvania, because we have far more people scale roads. So it's much easier to maintain the historic landscape. I really believe this. And I think that this idea of reusing buildings, and I applaud, Ryan, what you're doing. If you reuse the existing fabric and the footprints, you're maintaining the people scale in the community, within the city, wherever you are. And to me, that's as critical as preserving the actual individual built structures. But anyway.
All right, so yeah, a lot of good questions have come in. I know we're down to less than 10 minutes at this point, so I fear we're probably only going to get to one or two of them. So I think what I want to do is maybe try to combine a couple of them into maybe one big first question. I mean, we had a couple of questions come in about the tax credit programs, and I think some surprise, you know, Ryan's take, he avoids them at all costs, because that tends to be held up as one of the most successful things in the world of historic preservation is the federal tax credit program. And even people who aren't historians or preservationists take advantage of that and tout that as a pretty successful thing. But maybe that kind of, so a couple people asked about that, but maybe that kind of helps inform the big picture question I want to go with here, which is, you know, we just spoke for about an hour and a half about a pretty dramatic building reuse ordinance that flips how we approach our built environment as a very capitalist nation on its head, right? But the environment almost didn't come up at all. And most people would point to something like this as maybe the number one justification isn't the aesthetics of a beautiful main street or a character, a neighborhood with a lot of character, but is the environmental crisis we're facing with climate change, right? So that was actually one of the first questions to come in, was just about how does reuse or repurposing affect the carbon footprint of society. But so what do we do there? Why hasn't that come up in this discussion? Why do Americans in particular seem so averse to taking on the climate change debate head on? And so with that in mind, if we decided as a society that it's by far one of the most important environmental things we could do is stop sending buildings to landfills and then mining new materials to build, you know, new buildings and new structures, and all the environmental costs that come with the transportation. I know that's it's problematic in this country that is so capitalist and depends so much on growth and development. But so how do we get to a place where we can have that discussion, where maybe we see less of the barriers, like Orion in particular, and Sean talked about earlier, where people see it as too much red tape, too much slowdown, to a place where people just get that, you know, it makes sense to reuse the building stock that's here as much as possible, even if we do continue to build and add on to that. So I don't know what, that's a very...
I'm gonna use solar panels as a good example to answer this question. In the last 12 months, my company has done $110,000 worth of solar panel installations on 3 of our buildings that already exist. The process was cumbersome. We needed a secondary zoning permit, although it was by right. It was still, you know, something that needed to be filed. The only way that the solar made any financial sense was a layered revenue stream that was a immediate tax write-off for depreciation, a 30% tax credit from the federal government to the chip's return, SREC credits that could be sold, and incentive financial benefit of I think it was 5 cents for every kilowatt we created, which was a check returned from the city of Philadelphia, which it's been 10 months. We're still waiting on our first one. If you eliminated those things, solar was just a line item that ended up harming our construction budget. And solar panels as a whole doesn't really impact our PICO bill, right? Our electric bill. There's still the user fees, there's still the taxes, there's still the government regulation fees. It impacts our usage, but that's just a piece of our bill. And so it doesn't eliminate it. There's no benefit. And so I use that as an example because, you know, for deconstruction, it took us 3 extra months to demolish the inside of that building. What was financially beneficial was we had this credit at the end of there. And I think that this goes along the lines of some of the questions that were just asked, where there's this disconnect between preservation and the desire to preserve what a community is used to, and zoning code and the financials behind actual development. And I think that if you bridge those gaps with incentives, like the new zoning bonus for historic properties in Philadelphia, or you incentivize the use of solar panels by layering on these financial benefits. If you do these things, the attitude of the economics changes, because at the end of the day, I think we all want to do well. We don't want to use paper napkins and we don't want to use plastic bottles, but it's a pain in the ass to wash cotton napkins. And so at the end of the day, I think that the system as a whole, from a regulation standpoint, can incentivize the right actions. And I think if you layer them on top of each other, you start to bridge the gap that is missing between preservation and development.
So if I could, I guess, maybe offer a countering perspective for the Delaware Solid Waste Authority, their current kind of mode of operations is strictly, you know, for the most part, voluntary and market driven. So my limited experience in development projects that have been going on in my district, I've been asking the developers, well, what's happened when they're not historic resources necessarily, but just buildings they are tearing down. I say, well, what's happening with all the materials? And for the most part, my understanding is that they are mining these buildings for their bricks and the cement and the metal. I'm not sure what else, but, you know, they're telling me that they, you know, from a market-driven perspective, they have companies that will come in and take as much of these materials as they can. So, but I do think that beyond that, maybe beyond incentives, it's going to have to be largely regulatory. We need to raise landfill fees. We need to create regulation that requires them to do more. So I hate to say that, Ryan, but I don't see a lot of, you know, unless—
I'm just going to counter that comment with the more regulation and tax you put on it, like Philadelphia today announcing that they're going to add a 1% tax to all construction projects. My response to that is, then don't complain to me when my apartment that I'm going to rent to the community that is in a gentrifying neighborhood is now $950 a month instead of $900 a month. Because back end of that, I got to pay for that 1% somehow.
Frankly, I think landfill fees need to go up for all of us, not just for building materials.
Sure.
You know, we need to put the regulations there to cause us to change our behavior. I don't know what incentives are out there beyond what already exists, just from a market-driven, perspective for these materials. But anyway, I'm definitely open to any ideas that you have or anyone else. But I think it's going to have to largely be sticks rather than carrots to get us to the point where we get to a zero waste mentality in our culture. And this is just one piece of that.
I would just throw in, rather than looking at increasing regulations or incentives, another way you could look at it is, where can you reduce regulations that get you to where you want to be? And just being more smart about how you regulate things. You know, it's not easy, and that takes a lot of work, but I think that's the way that you do it that doesn't cost everybody quite as much, in theory.
Yeah, well, I guess Ryan's example of solar might be a good one for that, to reduce the barriers to solar rather than kind of penalizing solar. And that we are trying to investigate an option of menus for sustainability to implement in the county, where you can, maybe there would be 10 different aspects, solar being one of them, maybe building reuse or reuse of materials would be another, green roofs, the list might include a whole bunch of things, and then developers need to, pick a certain number of them. I've heard this is being done elsewhere, and it's something we want to look into.
All right, great. Well, I think it's 2:29, so we're nearly at our 2:30. I don't want to keep anybody here past what we've already agreed upon, but I just want to thank all of our panelists today and all of our attendees for tuning in. I think, I wasn't sure what was going to come of the conversation. It's such a big conversation. It's so nuanced. There's not a one-size-fits-all approach. And I think, that's been very clear today. I think everybody made really great points. And I liked hearing sort of the different perspectives from everybody. I think that's a really important conversation to have. So I think, it kind of sounds like we need to keep looking for where we can all meet in the middle. Where are those opportunities for compromise and flexibility, and how can we move towards our shared goals, whatever I guess we decide those are. So again, thank you to all of our panelists so much for your time today, and for all of our attendees. Thanks so much.